Okay, welcome everyone to chapter 17 and 18 of Crucifixion of the King of Glory. We're recording now. I thought these were a couple of very interesting chapters. 18 was real short, but still I thought it was quite interesting. So let's talk about that. Let's see if others have things specifically that they want to talk about while we're here to discuss these two chapters. So if we can kind of go around the room, quote unquote, based on who's with us tonight, that would be great. So if anyone has something that they'd like to talk about or make sure that we talk about, I would be happy to hear from you. Go ahead, Lori.
Page 162.
Okay.
Bottom of the second paragraph. This is something I've never heard before. She says, to this very day, the primary reason Jews reject Jesus as the Messiah is that he died by crucifixion. They still assume that he was cursed by God and therefore cannot be the Messiah. I'd never heard that before and thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean that cursed is he who hangs on a tree. It's actually quoted in the New Testament from the Old Testament. I don't remember the Galatians. I just don't remember. But in any case, it is quoted there also. So it's pointed out in the New Testament, and I hadn't heard from her that was I hadn't heard that was the primary reason. I'm not sure what her source is on that, but that's okay. It's pretty interesting, I would say. She's lived in this milieu of theological and religious education, except for the short time that she got her law degree. So she probably has a pretty good feel about it. And you could tell that she's a lawyer, I thought, but I knew that, so I couldn't unknow that. When I was these last two big chapters, 16 and 17, it seems that she really enjoyed researching it and talking about it and commenting on it. So, but again, I may just be reading my own thoughts into that. But okay, good. So that I thought was a very interesting piece. And either of the other of you would have something that you'd like to make sure that we really focus on?
I don't have anything specifically.
Okay, Laura, you had something else.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Page 165.
Okay.
She talks about, she says, they allege that the evangelists were trying to curry favor with the Roman state. Who is she talking about here, the evangelists?
She's talking about the four evangelists, Peter, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So she's critiquing here modern biblical scholarship, and essentially this line of thought that the evangelists downplayed Pilate's responsibility because they wanted the Christians wanted the Romans to like them, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Oh. Okay, good. So usually I've prepared.
I got something.
Go ahead, Christopher.
Yeah. I want to use like tangent, or some people talk they kind of go off the rails, but like what Lori was saying, how it's really detailed, and the book's really detailed, and you could tell it really goes really like a historical aspect, and it's really descriptive, and it really brings it all, and then she brings it back really well, like to the main topic. But I thought what was interesting was like the Gentile courts. I thought, like, since the people of the day were the priests were in charge, that everyone would just go to like the priest court, but I guess there was like Gentile courts.
Yeah, that isn't that interesting. And what's even more interesting is that the Romans built their fortress so that they could watch what was happening in the courts of the Gentiles, because they thought if there's going to be a riot, it's going to start there. So I thought that was very interesting too. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And in fact, that's kind of where the chapter starts, where she's talking about the Antonia fortress. Interesting that you know Herod had built that. Herod the Great had built that place and named it after Antony and Cleopatra. They weren't the ones who were the victors in that kind of civil war that happened in Rome at that time, but he didn't get punished for that. It's very interesting that the victorious Romans who didn't support Antony and Cleopatra didn't punish him for that. So he was on their side, and he didn't end up getting removed for that. So anyway, that's just a little interesting piece of Roman history, which I do like, I have to say. Okay, so we're talking about now Jesus's Roman trial, because we had the Jewish trial, and she goes into some detail first about sort of the way that the Romans, where they were located in Jerusalem. Okay, here's the temple, and they were up here above, so they had stairs that they could like run down into the court of the Gentiles in case they needed to keep order, in case things got out of control. Now they had the temple guard, so the Romans would only get involved if things were really if the temple guard couldn't keep people under control. It's interesting that they were very focused on Passover. They weren't ignorant of the Jews' religion. They knew what was happening here. They knew that this was the celebration of the freedom of the people from slavery in Egypt, and they knew that that was likely to cause people to have very strong patriotic feelings, and they knew that it's not like they loved the Romans ruling over them, and that this was a good time for a revolt. So I think that at least maybe not a good time, but a likely time for a revolt. So they knew all of that. And then she goes on this little tangent about where does the Roman governor stay when he's in Jerusalem. And that's kind of interesting to hear that there was another castle there, kind of where the governor could stay, but that it made sense that he would be staying at the Antonia fortress so that he could keep an eye with everybody else on what's happening during Passover in the temple, where trouble was likely to start. And she mentions that the provincial capital was not Jerusalem, but was Caesarea. Now, when you get a chance to go to the Holy Land, you're gonna love Caesarea. Like you can understand why they stayed there, and they didn't stay in the desert of Jerusalem. I mean, the water is that azure blue color that you see just in a few places in the world, and it's like if you've ever been to Croatia, to Dubrovnik, it has that same beautiful blue, light blue color. Anyway, it's just a lovely, lovely, lovely place, and you can see why it was that the governors would have much rather been there than in hot and dry Jerusalem. Okay, 1 second. I don't know what is going to the cathedral. So my wife is unloading wine now and asking me a question. Okay, so that I just want to put that plug in for Caesarea. It's beautiful, and you can understand why they made that their capital and not Jerusalem. Now, maybe many people didn't know that Galilee and Jerusalem were in two different kind of Roman provinces. Strictly speaking, Galilee was a kingdom, I guess, and Rome was Judea was a province. But in any case, that also comes out towards the end of this chapter. But since we're just talking about general Roman stuff, I thought that would be interesting. Okay, and then she talks a little bit about the administration of criminal justice in the Roman provinces. So bottom line is that they allowed the people that they took over to administer justice according to their practices. The only thing that they really reserved for themselves was capital punishment. And then the Romans would be kind of a court of appeal, maybe, depending on the status of the person that had been judged by the local court, by the local kind of laws where they had taken over. But they sort of created a layer over the places that they took over. They weren't looking to destroy what was there. They wanted tax money they wanted money from these people. They wanted money and slaves and so on and so forth. They weren't looking to destroy the place. They were looking to make money off of it. So they often left people in power there, maybe not who opposed them, but people who were not necessarily their greatest fans, but who could do the job, who could get the job done. And there was always this kind of relationship between the aristocracy, that is who the Romans more or less hired to run the place, and the Romans. And we've talked about that on many occasions already. Since it was a theocracy there in Judea, it was the chief priests and the high priest who were the sort of main, not just religious, but also main government people there, who were the aristocracy and who were running the place for the Romans, making sure that the taxes got paid, that there was no revolt, so on and so forth. So I think a big piece here is to realize that the Romans did not have this idea of blind justice, or that everyone is equal under the law. That was completely foreign to them. People who had a certain status, they had an equal justice, but justice was administered according to status, according to rank, and according to citizenship. So if you were a Roman citizen, you had certain rights that no one else had in the Roman Empire, and only about 10% of the people in the empire were citizens. The other 90% were not. So we see this most clearly in the scriptures when we see that St. Paul, when he was accused, being a Roman citizen, he was able to appeal to be able to appear in front of Caesar. And that's why this trip happened that we read about in the Acts of the Apostles, where he's being taken to Rome. That's why he's being taken there. So anyway, I think that's some pretty interesting information was there. Thoughts about this so far? Okay, so let's keep going. The powers.
I have a question.
Yeah,
I have
go
a
ahead,
question. I'm
Jasper.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I have two questions. So we'll use like the borders of current day Israel. So like, what do you think the population was back then? I mean, in
Actually,
like the current.
Yeah, we could probably figure it out exactly.
I mean, if you could guess. I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, in the year like 1 or 2. I mean, like population of like. So, I mean, that's like the borders is really what we're talking about. I mean, probably bigger. But I was just curious of like how many people were actually like 20 like 100,000 people?
my guess is it's maybe a couple 100,000, but it's a guess.
Yeah, that's
But
what I was that's what I was looking for as a guess.
yeah, but I would say like Judea, maybe a couple 100,000 people, maybe 150,000 people. Remember, it's a desert. Everybody
Right,
lived
yeah.
essentially off the fact that Jerusalem was there. Whereas in Galilee, it was super rich farmland, still is. And so there could have been more people there. Israel at time of Christ. Let's see what the oracle known as Google says here. The modern day Israel really borders the population at the time of Christ, about 500,000. Yeah, so we're in the ballpark. I'm sure it was more in Galilee, just because there was unlimited food and water, whereas in Jerusalem it was all very, very limited. Good question. You said you had 2.
I forgot. I forgot the other one.
Okay, very good. No worries. Okay, so the powers of the provincial governor. This is also an interesting piece, I thought. Again, I say it's interesting because I'm interested in Roman history, and I think that it's good for us as Christians to know some Roman history. So I've been trying to do that, and I do find it very interesting. Essentially, the governor was a dictator. He had all dictatorial powers. Person who was in charge of a province or one of the subjected kings of the Roman Empire. They had all the power essentially, but they couldn't hypothetically abuse it. They had even the power of capital punishment, but if they were just killing people randomly or breaking Roman law or doing especially things that were immoral according to Romans, then they could get recalled to to Rome, and have to answer for their for their governance. This famously happened to Julius Caesar, and on the way back, he decided he would just become the emperor and take everything over. So you may know that story, but he was in charge of Gaul, which for the France, Spain, England. Anyway, it was a pretty rough place at that time. So that's probably the most famous one that we know of. And that did happen to Pilate also. We read about that later, that he was recalled. He was recalled, but as he was returning, Tiberius Caesar died. And the Caligula, which was the next emperor, didn't pick up the case. So, and then Pilate disappears into history, but we'll get to that. So an interesting piece that the emperor's representative, whether that be a titular king or whether that be a governor of a province or whatever, had the emperor's authority, which they called the imperium. That's not that important, but he was essentially the emperor's guy there, and had all the same powers as the emperor. So another thing I thought was very interesting is the difference that between Roman law and, let's say, United States law or English law, which is what our law is based on, between what's criminal and what's civil. So a lot of things that happen between two parties, the Romans would consider to be civil law and not criminal, like stealing. That's a criminal offense in our legal system, but that was a civil offense in the Roman system. So those, I think, are very interesting things. Maybe not super important, but not unimportant. Yeah, and then she talks just a little bit more about the different classes of people and how they would be judged, and how a citizen had the most rights. Okay, so Roman concerns during Passover. So we talked about that a little bit. The Romans were not stupid. They understood what the Jews were celebrating, and they knew that this was a likely time for there to be some kind of revolt, and that's why the governor was always in Jerusalem before Passover, during Passover, even after Passover, until the crowds subsided, because they realized that this was a time when people were very excited about and very patriotic, and that this would be a very likely time, if there was going to be one, for a revolt. Okay, so now we get into this interesting conversation about how the interaction between the chief priests and Pontius Pilate went. And actually, it's very interesting. Again, we go through this so quickly in Holy Week that it's very easy to miss some of these details. Like, for instance, and this part is not mentioned in the gospel, but she mentions it, and surely it's true, that actually the Romans wouldn't have cared if the Jews killed Jesus. I mean, if they did it quietly, they weren't gonna cause a ruckus. They were concerned about stability and profitability of their provinces and their subjected kingdoms. They were not really worried about what we would call justice. That was not an interest of theirs. Everything was about keeping the population in a calm state and being able to extract taxes from that population. So we have to have that in mind as we go into this part of the chapter. So the Jews wanted the leaders of the Jews wanted Christ to be crucified, as I said, because that's a form of hanging, and that was considered to be something terrible. We're on that same page that Lori pointed out, and that was some kind of a curse, and so he couldn't possibly be the Messiah if he was cursed, according to this concept of Judaism. So that's why they wanted that form of death, and they could not do that. They did not have, what is that nice Latin phrase? They didn't have the power of the sword. What are they? Ius gladi, the right of the sword. They might have killed him quietly by stoning him or doing some other kind of thing, but to publicly kill someone, the Romans would not like that. They would not accept that, and the Jews knew that. So, but they wanted him killed publicly, and they wanted him killed in a very specific way, so that it would undermine his claims to be the Son of God. So this is the dynamic that we have going into this morning, because during the night the Jewish trial took place. Now we're talking about the morning, right? So the Romans apparently liked to work early, and when you're close to the equator, it's not quite the equator there, but it's pretty close. There's like 13 hours of sunlight in the summer and 11 in the winter. Like there's not much variation. And if you've ever lived in or visited one of these places that's near the middle of the earth, like it gets dark like that, and it gets light like that. It's not like in the northern or far northern climates like we live in, or far southern, where you have this long sunrise and this long sunset. It doesn't happen that way. It's just like that. And so it got hot there, and they wanted to do their work early in the morning before it got really hot. So she says that they typically began their work there about 6 o'clock, and they ended around noon. The religious leaders of the Jews were very well aware of their schedule, and they had hoped to kind of sneak in there, get Pilate to condemn Christ to death and have him crucified by the time people woke up, so that there was no danger of any revolt against them. They weren't worried. I mean, they were worried about revolts against Rome, but in this case, they were worried that people would revolt against them. Right. So they get to the Antonia fortress, and they don't go into the leaders do not go in. They take Jesus in to be questioned, but they don't go in because that would defile them from a ritual purity point of view, and there wouldn't be enough time for them to be ritually purified so that they could participate in the Passover service and so that they could eat the Passover. So they stayed outside. And this provides an interesting dynamic too, because obviously Christ, being God, knows everything that's going on outside. They can't hear the conversation that Pilate is having with him inside. And it can kind of get somewhat ironic and even a little bit funny sometimes. I like this St. John Chrysostom quote here that she has on page 163 towards the middle. They who paid tithes of mint and anise did not consider that they were defiled by becoming murderers, but thought that they defiled themselves by merely entering the court of Pilate. So again, big irony. Irony is a very popular rhetorical device used in the scriptures. So we read a little bit more about Pontius Pilate after this, who is a very interesting character, just from a literature point of view, just an interesting historical person. The governor's terms were 2 years in the Roman Empire. He served 5 consecutive 2-year terms. That's almost unheard of, which means, actually, speaking of Julius Caesar, he did something similar like that in Gaul. So there's very few governors in the history of Rome, whether that be in the imperial time or in the Republic, that would have had such a long tenure as Pilate. And Presbyteria kind of points out that this is probably because he was very good at what he did. He established good relationships with the people, and he was making good money. So he wasn't asking to be moved either, because even though officially, legally, it was not, you couldn't accept bribes. Apparently this was handled all the time. And we had learned earlier about in previous chapters, maybe just the previous chapter, about how the high priest always paid a big bribe to the Romans to be appointed each year, even though that's a complete bastardization of the way that those folks should be chosen. It's interesting to see how that system also was adopted by the Turks and the Orthodox during the time of the Turkish yoke. Very similar situation took place about who would be the patriarch. Not good, not bad, just interesting that those two things are very, very much aligned. So let's see, what else is very interesting. She points out that the reason that Pilate was probably there in Jerusalem was because of his rank. He wasn't of a senatorial rank, but he was pretty high ranking, but not high ranking enough to kind of live a life of luxury in Rome. And so even though he was a relatively high ranking person, nonetheless, he needed to go abroad to be able to make his fortune. And that's what he was doing there in Judea. He was an equestrian, for those of you who are really interested in Roman history. That's one step below being a senator. I thought the footnotes at the bottom of page 164 were super interesting, about how the kind of mistakes that Pilate made and what happened. Like he brought busts of Tiberius Caesar into Jerusalem, and the Jews had this like extemporaneous revolt. It just happened. It wasn't planned. It wasn't the aristocracy. It was the people, the common people, and they like marched out to Caesarea. Probably like a 2-day march, probably. And they were essentially protesting there at his official residence, and he had them surrounded. And he essentially said, you know, like, you're going to accept these busts in Jerusalem or you'll die. And everyone, to a man, went down on his knees to be ready to have his head cut off. And it was made such an impression on Pilate that people were willing to die rather than allow that in Jerusalem, that he removed those busts. So that I thought was very interesting. But he was not a Democrat by any means. Something similar happened. He took money from the treasury in the temple, which was not part of the arrangement that it should go to, that he should take that money directly. He was allowed some of it by their arrangement, taxes, so on and so forth. He took more. And so there was a revolt, again, not a revolt, but like a demonstration. But he didn't heed the call that time to return that. He used that money to build an aqueduct to Jerusalem. That aqueduct is destroyed now, but the ones out at Caesarea are still there. It makes a very big impression when you see those, and the amount of really incredible engineering they were able to accomplish. Very, very interesting. So I thought those footnotes were really neat. So if you didn't read those, please do. Okay, so now we get kind of to the question of was Jesus a rebel or was he not? And you know, again, I think there's a big critique of modern biblical scholarship here, which essentially biblical scholarship essentially exists to be able to debunk the Bible as something which is fake, which I know that sounds weird, but that's what it's kind of descended into. And so that's why when every chance she gets, this is my opinion, she takes a poke at him and to show that really it's not scholarship at all. It's just like skepticism. So her point is that she's making here is that Pilate didn't know Christ. There's no reason he would have known Christ. And the questions he asked both of Christ and of the Jewish aristocracy made it very clear that he did not know Christ until this very moment. And it makes some sense because Christ was not a threat. It's not like the Romans didn't have spies. Of course they did. They knew everybody who was a threat to their administration. And he never came up on their radar, so to speak. So there's no reason that they would know who he was. He did his miracles around Jews, not around Romans, and he had almost no interaction with the Romans. There are some times that he did, like the centurion and so on and so forth, but very rarely. And so there were no reports of him. He just wasn't interesting to them because he wasn't a threat. And so this is the first time that Pilate is meeting him. So that I think is interesting. Again, that's part of her sort of larger critique here in this chapter of modern biblical scholarship. So, and she points out, I think, very well and very truly that if he had been, if Christ had been a real danger to the Romans, the Sanhedrin would have just brought him to the Romans. They would have just killed him on the spot. It just wasn't there. There's this kind of trial that took place, quote unquote, between Pilate and Christ. I mean, essentially, he would have just said, "Okay, you're on our bad list. We kill you. That's it. There's no ability to appeal. There's just, that's just what it is." So both the Jews and the Romans, the Jews knew that was not the case, and so they didn't bring Christ there in that way. They had to try to massage the situation. And that's what this kind of middle part of the chapter is all about, where they're sort of saying, well, he's evil, he's a traitor, he's this, he's the king of the Jews, Well, they didn't say that, but in any case, we have that conversation with Pilate as we go on. So, yeah, it's an interesting little sidebar about the way that crimes were rectified in the Roman Empire. Unless you were in Rome or in some other massive metropolis, there weren't police, there weren't prosecutors. If you were wronged, if a crime happened against you, you had to like track that guy down. You had to bring people with you to forcibly arrest that person. You had to bring that person to the proper court of justice. You had to be the prosecutor. You know, you needed to have witnesses. It wasn't easy actually to kind of get justice, quote unquote, in those days. And I thought that's essentially what the Jews did. They arrested Christ themselves. They already put the case together. They brought it to Pilate, but it's immediately he recognizes that it's not for him, because there's no violation of Roman law there. And that's why he says, go judge him yourself. You know, okay, he's saying on one hand, like, I'm kind of busy. There's a lot of things coming up here in the next 24 hours. We have the Passover, so on and so forth. They're like, don't waste my time. But it wasn't because he was lazy. It's because there was no violation of Roman law. So there was nothing for him to do. So that I think is very, very interesting. Now we get this, let's hold on for a second. Right. Yeah. So we've talked about all those things. I think she talks a little bit about how the trial, quote unquote, took place. Okay. After Pilate had tried to say, you know, like, there's nothing for me to do here. This is your thing. This is a religious question. Go judge him yourself. Finally, they get him to at least ask him some questions. And so he does this cognitio, this Roman judicial examination. That would have never happened with a Roman citizen. But Christ was, like the other Jews, considered essentially a slave by the Romans. Not exactly, a little, just like one step higher than that, but essentially a slave. So they weren't going to take the time to go through a whole Roman trial here. So essentially, this Pilate asked him questions, and Christ did or did not answer them. And of course, at some point, he used that famous phrase, "You have said it," you know, when he's asked if he's king of the Jews. All right, so I think we get to this question of the kingship of Jesus. Was Jesus Christ the king of the Jews? She makes the point that Pilate was being sarcastic when he asked this question, because he thought that this question was just ridiculous, that he was, you know, he didn't look like a king, he didn't have an army, he didn't have a plan, he wasn't a rebel, he was telling people to be peaceful and to pay Roman taxes, and so he thought that was kind of funny. Then it turns out that Pilate finds out that Christ is from Galilee, and he sends him off to Herod Antipas, who was the son of Herod the Great, who happened to be in Jerusalem for Passover. So that was great. Pilate was really happy about that. 3 times he tried to essentially tell the Jews, like, what do you want me to do? It doesn't violate Roman law. There's nothing I can do about it. Just take him away. And then he's like, okay, great. He's not even my subject. So again, he had no right to. Jesus didn't break any Roman laws in Judea, and he didn't even live in Judea. Officially, he was from Galilee. So Pilate was kind of like, great, like, I can wash my hands of this. I got all these things to do. I'm going to send him off to Herod Antipas. And so Antipas essentially just wanted to see like some kind of magic trick for Jesus to do. And he didn't do that. He figured out, he thought, okay, he's a fraud. So I will just essentially dress him up in these fancy clothes as quote unquote king of the Jews, which really Herod Antipas kind of was supposed to be, and send him back. So again, Pilate had this problem that Jesus returned to him. As many times as he tried to sort of excuse himself from this business, nonetheless, it kept coming back to him. Finally, then his wife says, I don't want you to have anything to do with him. I just had a dream about him. I think in King James it says she suffered many things in a dream because of Christ. But she had like a bad dream that had to do with Jesus Christ, or maybe not bad dream, but anyway, a dream. And then this happened. So, and then it says, as in Matthew, for he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him. And then besides, while he was sitting in the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much over him today in the dream. So, and then we read about how Pilate's wife became a Christian, Claudia. And then there's this kind of conversation about the fate of Pilate. So what happened to him? And we honestly don't know. I mean, I think that we can boil it right down and say, we honestly don't know. He apparently killed a bunch of Samaritans some years after Christ was crucified. And he was called back to Rome. As he was going to Rome, Tiberius died. Caligula became the new emperor, wasn't interested in pursuing these charges. Pilate was already in Rome. And so Presbyteria Eugenia supposes that the most likely scenario is that he simply just retired in Rome, and he had enough money based on what he had collected when he was in Judea, and that's that, and that's how he finished his life. Yeah, so I think that the one little piece I really like, this last paragraph of the chapter, so I'm going to read it to you, and then we'll sort of open it up to questions and conversations. But as Jesus stood before him, Pilate had no idea that his name would forever be remembered, and that this little trial would become the most famous trial in world history. That I found that very impressive. We often don't even understand when we're in the midst of something really big or really great. I guess we didn't really touch chapter 18, but I tried to bake it in as we talked. Essentially, Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. We read more about this little piece in chapter 18, but it's like 3 pages. So we can talk about that if you want to, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Any questions about chapter 17 or 18?
It's great research.
Yeah, I think it is, and I personally found it really, really helpful. I'll say this chapter 17 especially, like Jesus was here, then he was here, then he was here and here, like that all happens so fast in Holy Week that it's kind of hard to keep track of what's happening. I found the way that she laid it out actually really useful. So I listened to this chapter again. I had listened to the whole book previously, then I read it, and I listened to it again today. I really thought that this chapter 17 was a great chapter. To me, it was super, super helpful. And maybe it's like because I'm in this phase of being interested in Roman history. Maybe that's why. I don't know. But I found it to be really, really useful for me in thinking about those relatively short gospel readings that are happening in Holy Week when all of this is taking place.
Yeah, I particularly, I'll say, enjoyed the extra biblical context for a lot of the people and the situations that were going on that you don't necessarily get from just reading the Gospels themselves.
Yeah, these were real people who existed, like Herod Antipas. It's a known person. There's a history of this person. Pontius Pilate, there's a known person. This is a history of this person. And to have that context, I agree with you. To have that context, I think just makes it that much richer when we talk about these most important gospel passages for us as Christians. Lori, did you want to say something? I feel like I cut you off. Okay. Good. Yeah, chapter 16 and 17 were long, 16 I thought was okay, kind of interesting to know about the high priests and the exact details of the corruption. But yeah, this 17th chapter I found really helpful, especially all this movement of Jesus on this day, uh, it, which is a very busy day. This when we're celebrating. Christopher, I think you raised your hand, so go ahead.
I always thought all the disciples of Jesus died after Jesus died, and then I guess John got beheaded before Jesus died. Right? That's what the book said.
I'm going to go back and look because the church's tradition is that John was the youngest. John was the youngest, but
Yeah.
he lived the longest. He wrote the Apocalypse in probably about the year 90. So
Yeah. I think we're confusing John the theologian with John the Baptist.
there we go.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, that makes sense. Yes, John the Baptist and Herod Antipas. This is
Yes. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. Sorry.
Yep. No, it's good. So John the Baptist was we probably all know some of these people. John the Baptist was one of those people that could not be quiet. When something was wrong, he would have to say it. And even though Herod liked John, he had taken his brother Philip's wife, as his wife, Herodias. And so Herodias was not a big St. John the Baptist fan. And if you remember, there was this meal that they had, and Herodias' daughter danced for Herod, and he said, "I'll give you anything you want, even after half of my kingdom." And she said, "I want John the Baptist's head here in a bowl, essentially."
Yeah.
And because of the way that the Eastern kings thought of their kingship, they couldn't go back on something that they promised. If they said they would do something, they have to do it. And so that's why this was a very dangerous thing that he said. I'll give you anything. Okay, they have to follow through on that, or else they would be considered not a king. Someone who's a king would have to follow through on their word. So that's how that all happened. So that I think is very interesting. That's how John the Baptist ended up dying.
And
Before
I have a side comment about that. So it's interesting that you said that John the Baptist was the most outspoken, and that also that Baptist churches are the loudest in Presbyterian. So I thought that was a nice connection.
It could be. He but John the Baptist, he was preaching that Jesus was the Christ, or at various points that the Christ was coming. Okay, but it's interesting because according to the church's teaching, when he died, he continued his preaching in Sheol, which was the place where the Jews were waiting for the Messiah to come and free them. Not hell like Bugs Bunny hell with fire and devils and brimstone and stuff, but just this dark place is what they called it Sheol. And they all were waiting there for the Messiah to come. And since I think the church sort of assumes since John the Baptist couldn't be quiet in the world, he was not quiet there. And he let those people know that the Messiah was in the world and they were soon to be freed, even those who had maybe for thousands of years been waiting there. Good. Any other questions or comments that folks would like to make?
Synopsis. Thank you.
Thank God. Okay, good. So I didn't prepare a study guide this time. I didn't have time. So I'll send out an email and ask people how that was. I prefer to do a study guide, but in a pinch, maybe we would have to do this again in the future. But if everybody just hated it terribly, then I'd be a little less likely to do it than if it was tolerable. So anyway, you can look for that email coming up, probably when I announce that we've posted this on our YouTube channel. Okay, everyone, let's pray, and then we will say good night, and I will go figure out what to do with 135 liters of wine. It is truly meet to bless thee, the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless, and Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption give us birth to God, the Word, the very Theotokos, thee do we magnify. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Good
Thank
luck
you,
on the
thank you for your
task with the
time.
wine. Oh, Father
Thank you.
Gregory, before you go,
Yeah.
on Saturday, what time is vigil at the cathedral? I was looking online, and some places said 6, some place said 6:30.
Should be 6. 6:30 is for 6:30 is for weekdays. 99% sure, but hold on, I will tell you right now. So we'll
Then-
go to the cathedral site. Raspissania. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm looking at the their website on the right at the top there, and it's in Russian it says 6:30, in English it says 6.
Yeah, they want the Americans to show up first. No, it's at 6. Yeah, 6 o'clock is Saturday night.
Okay.
And Sunday night. Everything else is 6:30.
Okay.
Excellent. Great. So we'll see you there. Are you at church Friday night and Saturday morning? What's your plan?
I would say we are strongly leaning towards tomorrow night, but probably not Saturday morning.
Okay, very good. Very, very good.
I'd already I did talk to Father Colin about that,
Okay,
and I just sent out the rubrics for all
okay,
that. But
super.
yeah,
Okay,
I think that's
very-
going to be too tight, and depending how the weather is, I don't want to risk not being there on time for the Saturday evening services. So
sure. That makes perfect sense.
yeah.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, super. Thank you, Ken. We'll see you there.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.